Hello everyone, this is Keith Gallinelli and I'm here with my father Frank Gallinelli, the president of RealData Software, and we're moving on to the next in our series of podcasts about RealData, the software company, and what it transitioned into. So Frank, as we get started, can you kind of just give us a little bit of an overview or a reminder of how you got started with RealData?
Yeah, and again, thanks Keith for hosting these podcasts. As you said, this is the third in our series. Well, back early in the 1980s, before there was really a consumer computer business or consumer software business, I was playing around with one of these big old boat anchor type of boxes, and I tried to use it to analyze a commercial property that I wanted to purchase for myself. Now, when I got done with that, some friends of mine took a look at the analysis that I had done and said, that's kind of interesting. I think we'd like to try to do something like that for ourselves. Light bulb goes off in my head.
Of course, it wasn't a boat anchor. It was one of those old computers. And I remember this because I was young at the time, but it was one of those kind of giant 8-inch floppy drive computers, and it had the green screen that didn't really have much. There was no Windows at the time. There was no Mac. There was no really kind of user interface, but it was the basics of what got you started on this pathway to coming up with investor software for real estate analysis.
Yeah, and as I said, after my friends took a look at this and they said, maybe we'd like to do something like this, I thought, well, let's give this a shot. Let's see if maybe more people would like to do this, and RealData was born. The software.
And what were some of the software products that you had first had? Like, I know there's real estate investment analysis, and that's really focusing on either a residential or a small commercial property. What other software products did you come up with at the time?
Well, there were a couple of them, two of which we still have, of course, in their obviously much later generations. We had one called Commercial Industrial Development, which is for the budget pro formas. If you're building or developing a income property, we had one called Financial Analysis, which regrettably doesn't exist anymore. We had some models for residential realtors. Those don't exist anymore, but more products evolved over time.
Okay. And also, speaking of evolving, it was kind of like an evolutionary process when you started on the path of software, but then you moved more into investor education. So how did that really come about?
Yeah, you're exactly right when you say it was an evolutionary process, because we're going our way with the software, and as with any software company, of course, we get customer support calls, and you would think, since the software industry is such a novelty, such a new thing, that most of your support calls would be things like, how do I install the software? How do I find or save files? Which button do I push if I want to print a report? And yes, of course, we got software support questions just like that. But after a while, we began to notice that people were asking us things that weren't really specifically about software or about computers. They were asking us content-based questions.
Your customers were starting to ask you not just technical questions, but they're starting to ask you more real estate-focused questions. What are some of those questions that they started asking you right in the beginning?
Well, I can remember quite often we would get a question something like, why don't you count debt service, mortgage payments, as an operating expense? Or even just mortgage interest, which we know is a deductible expense. Why don't you count that as an operating expense? Why is my internal rate of return going down over time instead of going up? Or why is it so low, negative number, or so ridiculously high? Or why is my cash flow bouncing around? They would ask questions like this.
Okay, it's funny. I'm thinking of an episode of The Simpsons where it was kind of when Homer was starting to think about doing some sort of a marketing plan, and he had a book that said advanced marketing, and then it flashes forward to a second, a second later, and he's got a book that just says marketing, and then it flashes forward to just the dictionary. And when you start mentioning some of these things, internal rate of return, cap rate, mortgage interest, operating expenses, I think this kind of is, these are questions that if it kind of what's old is new again. When, people 20, 30, 40 years ago were doing real estate investing, there's now a new group of people that are coming into this world, and they're having the same questions, and they're asking the same questions about the same types of terminology, and maybe they didn't really know about them. Can you talk a little bit about how that kind of transitioned into the education piece?
Exactly. I mean, when we saw that people didn't understand, they would ask as you were saying, what's a cap rate, for example? Or what is net operating income and why do I care? When I realized that people were using our investment analysis software, and at least some of them didn't understand this terminology, didn't understand these metrics, how they were used, what the metrics were telling them, and so on. So this is not a good thing. Okay, we need to do something about this, and maybe instead of just being reactive and answering people's questions when they call up and ask them, which of course we're always happy to do, maybe we should do something that's more proactive to help make sure that investors who use our software or even contemplate using our software will understand the basics, the fundamentals of how you evaluate an income-producing piece of real estate, how you understand the metrics, what the metrics can tell you. So we wanted to do something proactive.
And when you start talking about being proactive, again, we're going back in time a bit before there was a lot of the social media that exists now. How exactly did you do this?
Yeah, so social media was almost non-existent. There was some very primitive sort of stuff like special interest groups where people would exchange messages and that sort of thing. But we were kind of early adopters with having a website. And since we had a website, I decided what I would do is to publish articles on topics that would resonate with our customers because they were articles on topics that they had been asking questions about. Now, of course, articles on a website, that's what we would call today a blog post. But back when we were writing these, or I was writing these, there was no such thing as a blog. So I didn't call it a blog, I called it articles.
And do you think writing these articles helped educate people, or you were able to get in touch with the people that, again, you're hoping will be future customers of RealData?
Well, I certainly hope so. Of course, this is hard to everything we do with our software is based on quantifying things, and this is something that's very difficult to quantify. But if I were to take just anecdotal information, I think we got a lot of positive feedback that people were getting something out of this. And I'll have to admit, I had a bit of a self-serving motivation behind doing this because I felt that if people understood how to analyze a real estate investment, then they would see the value of RealData's software to analyze real estate investments. So there was kind of a synergy that I was hoping to promote between the education and the software that we produced.
And I think that maybe somebody had noticed it going even a step back, not just on the website, but back to real paper book publishing. Somebody noticed some of these articles that you were putting together, and that was one of the next steps in this process of becoming an educator in the real estate finance world.
Yeah, actually, you're exactly right there, that one of the serendipitous, totally unplanned, actually there were two serendipitous and totally unplanned results of publishing these articles. And probably the most conspicuous one was one day I'm sitting at my desk, doing whatever it is I do, and the phone rings, and it's an editor from McGraw-Hill. Now, I knew absolutely nothing about the book publishing industry, and I quickly proved that fact with this phone call because I didn't realize that when somebody from one of the major publishing houses calls you up out of the blue and says, I've read some of the stuff that you've written, you kind of a strange sense of humor, and maybe you could write a book for us. What do you think about looking into that? Now, when somebody like that calls up, you're really supposed to be demonstrating enormous gratitude. But I didn't know anything about book publishing, and I didn't know that, when they call me, instead of me calling them, that I'm supposed to be really, impressed.
You're supposed to be very thankful and very like, oh my goodness, I can't believe you've called me.
Yeah, right. No, instead I gave the guy a hard time. Right? I said, yeah, sure, whatever. And so he said to me, well, I want, you know what I'll do? I'll send you a book that we published once before. Take a look at it. I think we'd like to have something along those lines. So he sends me the book, and I take a look at it, and I call him back, and I say, I'm not writing something like this. I'm sorry. Not on your life. Have a nice day. I said, well, what's the problem? He says, well, for one thing, I'm not sure I know more than a handful of people who could understand this book. I know I certainly can't understand this book, so there's really no point in my trying to write something like this book. He says, all right. So why don't you knock me off a couple of chapters of something you think you could write about? We'll take a look and see what we think.
And that led to your book.
Yeah, and the rest, as they say, is history. I wrote the book.
You'll have to remind me before you talk too much longer, because I always forget the exact title. There's a number in there. There's some financial. What is the exact title of the book?
Right. Even I have a hard time with this title. They came up with this title. I didn't really care for it, but why should I argue with success? It's what every real estate investor needs to know about cash flow and 36 other key financial measures. I think that's the correct title. In any event, there's no accounting for taste, I've always said, because they didn't think it was going to be any big deal. I certainly didn't think it was going to be any big deal. But now here we are. It's in its third edition, and it has sold, I believe, something like 30 or 40 times as many copies as their original high-end forecast. So,
well, that's great. Congratulations.
And it's still going.
It's still going. So then you said there was two serendipitous moments. One, of course, was the publishing of your book. Right. And what was the second one?
I get a call, again, sitting at the same desk, doing whatever I do, and someone who read one of my articles said, "Boy, this is kind of interesting stuff. I'd like you to meet the director of a graduate program at Columbia University. It was a Master of Science in Real Estate Development." I said, "Fine." Turns out that he lived in the neighborhood where I had lived, so we met for lunch and whatnot. Again, long story short, he hires me to do what it was initially 2-day orientation lecture in finance for this entire group of grad students. But it evolved, we got a lot of evolution going on here, it evolved into me becoming an adjunct professor for about a decade and a half, teaching real estate investment analysis, real estate finance. And I got to tell you, first time somebody called me professor, just about knocked my socks off. That was not something I was expecting to have happen.
Well, you were a professor for, about 15 years, I think, right?
Yeah, I say, but yeah, that's how long I taught there. Just before COVID, I had some other commitments, so I couldn't teach that year. And then COVID kicked in, and there were no on-site classes, so didn't do it then. That's when I decided, it's probably time to hang up my laser pointer and not do any more in-person classes, and not take Metro North into the city to do this any longer. But interestingly enough, instead of doing that, what I did was develop an online course, and you know well about this because you helped me do the videos for the online course.
No, and definitely, and I think this is one of the kind of the next steps in the development of Real Data, is that I know I worked with you. You came up with a lot of the content. I was helping more along the lines of doing the editing and things like that for the course. But tell me a little bit about the online video course and how you took what you had experienced both in the software company, writing a book as a professor, and then put it all together into a video course that pretty much anyone can take anywhere in the world and learn a little bit more about the fundamentals of real estate investment.
Basically what I did initially was to take most of the content that I would deliver as part of my in-person Columbia course. But over time, as you well know, as the creator of the videos for me, I increased the content. Actually, over the next several years, virtually doubled the content of that course, so that it's now really a very comprehensive education in real estate investment and finance, even in development and partnerships, and all kinds of related topics that would be of interest to people in this field. And so once COVID hit, and I couldn't teach any longer in person, and at that point really didn't even choose any longer to teach in person, the folks at Columbia called up and said, how about instead of teaching in person, that we offer this course to our incoming students. We recommend this course to our incoming students as kind of a ramp up to their high-powered financial curriculum. And so we've done that now for several years.
No, and I remember building the course too. It started out kind of like the progression of the software in the books. We started off with talking a lot about the definitions of terms that people would need to know, whether it be cap rate or APOD or net operating income, and then developing into case studies, whether you're doing a residential property, a small commercial property, doing some case studies with partnerships, and it really transitioned into a kind of a fully standalone course to get somebody ready, not just in real estate, but finance in general. And I think that, this is definitely a tool that people could use as a virtual textbook in their classroom.
Yeah, exactly right. I don't think that it would be like a 4-credit course in a college or university, but certainly to be a virtual textbook, the way the Columbia students have been using it for the last couple of years.
Yeah, well, it's also one of the nice things about doing online courses, and I do this a lot as well, is you can speed it up. So instead of listening to the course at a one-time playback rate, you can just double the rate, and there you go. You've got a half-time course, and you're able to cover a lot more material in a shorter amount of time. So if people do want to find out more about this course or how they could possibly use it for themselves, or if they were a professor and wanted to use this as a virtual textbook, how can people find out more about the course?
That's kind of the next step, I think, that we're going to be taking in regard to our educational initiative, if you will. I'm anxious to reach out to other professors, teachers of real estate finance in colleges and universities, and to see if we perhaps can kind of do the same sort of thing that we did with Columbia, making this available as a virtual textbook for their students if they choose to. And anyone who wants to see it, curriculum and the general information about it. Here, I've written down the URL. learn.realdata.com/p/academic.
Excellent. All right, so learn.realdata.com/p/academic. Or, of course, people can just reach out directly to you by going to realdata.com, and that will connect you directly with, or connect people directly to you.
Exactly. Or they can also email me at education@realdata.com. That's where I kind of filter through the communications that have to do with the educational component. But yeah, absolutely. I'm glad to hear from people, and I hope that somebody will find this useful the way the students that have been taking the course have found it.
All right. Well, great. Well, thank you very much for episode 3 of the podcast of Real Data and the Investor Education, and I think there's going to be a couple more coming up in the near future, correct?
Yeah, watch this space, as they say.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much, Frank, and we look forward to seeing you on the next podcast with Real Data.
Thank you, Keith.